Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Dividock, and I'm the supervisor for the Planning, Zoning, and Land Use Unit within the Planning and Local Business Development Division here in Oakland County. Welcome to today's virtual planners gathering, best practices in planning and zoning for solar PV. I have just a few reminders. The meeting is being recorded. Hold on, just the meeting is being recorded and will be made available on our website. And if you have any questions, please use the chat function in Zoom and direct your questions to Jim Schaefer. Jim will moderate a question and answer session after the presentations have completed. Also want to mention closed captioning is available and it's enabled on your toolbar. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. We have Deb Perry, Program Director of Clean Energy and Climate Resiliency for International City County Management Association, or ICMA. Also, Kelsey Dombrowski, Program Manager with ICMA. We also have Dr. Sarah Mills, Director for the Center for Empowering Communities, Graham Sustainability Institute, University of Michigan, and Nicole Card, Sustainability Specialist with Oakland County's Office of Sustainability. So thank you all for joining us today. Nicole, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you everyone for making the time to attend. My name is Nicole Card, and as Ryan said, I'm the Sustainability Specialist with the Oakland County Office of Sustainability. If you have any questions throughout the presentation or after the presentation, feel free to email me and my contact information is there. We can go to the next slide, Ryan. Okay, so I just wanted to quickly touch on why Oakland County has chosen to work with SoulSmart, and SoulSmart is the organization that has gathered Sarah, Deb, and Kelsey to give this presentation and this training. They're also a certification program and a technical assistance program that's available for local government, so both county and at the municipal level. And we have several goals that we wanted to accomplish at Oakland County. Specifically, the county executive has 8 strategic goals, and you can see 4 of them on the right side of the screen there: the thriving and inclusive economy, healthy residents, sustainability, and livable neighborhoods. All of these goals can be served through increased solar adoption. So it's a goal of Oakland County's Office of Sustainability specifically to improve the efficiency and ease and capacity of our local governments to adopt solar more easily and with more understanding of the process. Since at the county level, we don't control any of the zoning and planning that you folks work on, increasing your capacity and your knowledge is really our goal. And one other thing that I wanted to touch on is just that as we are seeing, we're living in an increasingly changing energy landscape, both with new energy demand coming from AI and data centers or from just a change in the supply and the transition. Solar really does provide some resilience for that. So we're hopeful that this can be a helpful training, and we know it will be because SoulSmart provides, as you'll see, a lot of experts that can provide guidance and best practices and free technical assistance. In addition to this live training, they also provide access to pre-recorded trainings that are a great resource. And since it is a certification program, SoulSmart is also a way for us to measure our success and progress as we work through this process. So next slide. Wanted to talk briefly about Oakland County's own commitments and solar initiatives. The main commitment is the county executive's goal to reduce our county operations greenhouse gases by 50% by 2035 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So the first big step to that is actually starting next year. We're working with an offsite power purchase agreement to get 75% of our electricity sourced from solar, but we also want to do more on-site solar and our own solar generation. So our first solar panel installation was in 2023, about 140 solar panels. And there are also some smaller solar projects at some of our parks, like solar restrooms and solar EV chargers. And I believe that might be, oh no, I have one more slide, please, Ryan. One other thing I wanted to plug is some additional resources and upcoming events that we have. So SolSmart is helping us with this training, the planning and zoning, but they also provide a permitting and inspection training that we're hoping to move forward with in the future. So just keep an eye on the Oakland County resources to see when that comes through. It's not scheduled yet. We do have some Solarize events planned for early 2026. So these will be open to residents, but also commercial owners, nonprofits, houses of worship, and local governments. So the next PowerPoint that I have there, the solar resource pages, those Solarize events will be posted on those pages once the dates are set. And we have two separate pages, one for residents and one for local governments to look through some of the resources that we've collected. This training will be posted on the local government page once the recording is all set up. And there's also an opportunity Oakland County hosts a PACE program. So we'll have that linked in the slides as well as Michigan Saves. And the last thing, the Michigan Solar for All program has been canceled federally, but we're just keeping an eye on the lawsuit. So that updates about that will also be posted on the local government website. And that is actually my last slide. So I will pass it along to SolSmart to get into the training. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. So again, I'm Deb Perry. I'm going to get us started, and then we'll kind of share this presentation with Sarah Mills and Kelsey Dombrovsky. If you go to the next slide. So what we'll cover today, we are going to tell you a little bit more about the SolSmart program. Nicole kind of teased how the program works, but I'll explain that a little more. We're going to talk about solar trends and the policy context in Michigan. So, that really underpins the opportunities for things like planning and zoning. And so we want to help everybody kind of understand what's going on in the state. We'll have Sarah Mills will help fill us in there. We'll then talk about incorporating solar into local planning and share best practices, and then transition into talking about zoning best practices, and then really talk again about Michigan-specific considerations, because you do have some interesting state policy to navigate there, with plenty of time at the end for questions. Although at any time, feel free to put your questions in the chat, as was mentioned. So if you go to the next slide, again, I'm Deb Perry from ICMA, and I'm joined by Kelsey Dombrovsky, who's on my team as well. And I'm really thrilled to have Sarah Mills presenting with us today, who, again, brings a lot of that Michigan-specific expertise. So on the next slide, I'm going to mention again, what is SolSmart? So we are a national program. We are funded by the Department of Energy and have been for 9 years. So the program has a long history. We have a lot of resources that we've created over those years, templates, recorded webinars, fact sheets, a huge repository of resources for local governments. And that is the target audience for our work. So we help local governments navigate the solar landscape. It has changed a lot in 9 years. It is changing a lot this year. We'll talk about some of that. And so again, we have a lot of resources to share and expertise, and a lot of examples from other communities, that sort of thing. It's a technical assistance program, so every community that joins gets support to figure out the strategies that work best for them, depending on what they're trying to do. And then ultimately, communities can earn designation. And that is essentially a plaque on the wall recognizing the accomplishments that you've made. If you go to the next slide, the work of SolSmart is organized into these 5 categories. So permitting and inspection, which Nicole mentioned, we do a lot of training of our code officials, talk about best practices in things like building permitting, electrical permitting, inspection processes, how to make those processes effective, make sure we're installing systems safely and to code, but also efficient, and kind of driving down the timelines, how long it takes to get a permit, that sort of thing. And then planning and zoning, again, these are our kind of 2 foundational buckets. Permitting and inspection and planning and zoning are 2 big places that local governments can have a big impact on making solar projects easier, more affordable, again, safer, more efficient. But we also do work in government operations. In this bucket, we're talking about the actions local governments can take. For example, installing solar on your own buildings or properties, or procuring solar from an offsite project. We do a lot of work on community engagement, and as that sounds, how do we help as a community identify the right goals, the right strategies, implement those strategies. And then the last bucket, market development, a bit of a catch-all here, but how can local governments create a more thriving solar market? And that can be things like local incentives or programs to help drive costs down, or engaging with solar developers and workforce development. And so again, these are kind of the 5 categories that we work in, but can basically, offer that technical assistance on just about anything that a local government can or wants to do as it relates to solar policy and strategy. On the next slide, I mentioned we have a ton of best practices and technical assistance documents and support. So we have our program guides that kind of helps navigate the program through the designation and identifies what those practices are. For every action, there's basically a points associated with that, and communities that get through the program basically, again, get that recognition at the end. And on the next slide, you'll see we've had 561 communities get all the way through that process and earn that recognition. We do it in tiers. So basically, the more actions you take, the higher levels of recognition you receive, from bronze to silver, gold, and then platinum. And the platinum level is fairly new. We've had 7 communities across the country reach that designation level. So they're really kind of the cream of the crop in terms of the work that they're doing, and again, some of the models and things that they provide. So that is the SoulSmart program. Now we'll kind of get to the meat of the training today. So again, we really want to start with talking about that context and doing maybe some level setting so everyone understands what is going on with solar and what is going on in Michigan. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Deb, and I'm excited to be able to partner with you on this. I've been pointing Michigan local governments to SoulSmart every opportunity I can, and this is the first time, though, I think that we've actually gotten to partner. So I'll quickly walk you through, again, the trends and policy context, and effectively why it's important for Michigan local governments to prepare. If you go to the next slide, there's been a lot of changes in legislation in the last couple of years. As you see, nothing really this year, but a lot of these policy changes are just now starting to have an impact on what we're seeing being deployed. So a bunch of these were all packaged together in the fall of 2023. So PA 235 updated the state's renewable portfolio standard, requiring utilities to get 50% of the electricity that they sell from renewables by 2030, when we are currently at about 20%. So we've got quite a bit to go in order for the utilities to reach that 50% by 2030 goal. There's a further requirement of 60% renewables by 2035. That same law also increased the amount of renewables that utilities have to allow customers to connect in. So this is predominantly for people who want to have rooftop or backyard solar panels. Previously, the utilities only had to allow 1 or 2% of their customers to connect in. That law effectively raised that. So now the utilities have to allow at least 10% of their customers to connect in if those customers want to. Another law that I'll talk about a bunch later, so I'm just going to quickly go over this, is PA 233, and this provided a state level option for large scale renewable energy projects. And again, won't belabor that because we'll come back to that. Also of relevance, PA 108 for large scale renewable energy projects created an actually not even super large scale, it starts at 2 megawatts, created a payment in lieu of tax option to allow local governments to kind of lock in what property taxes they would receive over time. I'm a super big property tax nerd, so if you want to know more about that, we're not going to talk about it here really, but ask me a question and I can go into it. Another change that happened in 2023 was that the legislature put into law rules associated with PA 116, that's the state's farmland preservation program. They effectively codified what MDARD had been, how they had been implementing this in the past, effectively allowing solar panels on land that's in PA 116 and allowing the landowner to defer their PA 116 tax credits. But any of those projects that are on PA 116 land have a number of conditions that have to be met, including decommissioning, including planting of pollinator habitat. And another change that's relevant more often to kind of rooftop or backyard solar is PA 68 of 2024, which effectively says homeowners associations can't ban solar panels in their developments. So even if it's written into kind of bylaws, those are unenforceable. If you go to the next slide, very often I get questions in communities like, is it sunny enough in Michigan for solar? And on a rainy day like today, maybe it doesn't feel like it. And people will pull up this map, which is showing solar radiation across the country. Michigan, you can see, is in the lowest tier. But typically, I have this animated and it brings up a red circle around the legend there to show that this is not like a 0 to 10 kind of legend. A solar panel in Ann Arbor produces about 70% of the power of one in Phoenix, Arizona. And so, yes, it is not the sunniest place in the country, and it's still economically viable to produce solar or produce power from solar in Michigan. If you go on to the next slide, one of the reasons for this is that solar panels have just gotten really cheap. So you can see how much solar costs have declined over the last 15 years. Some people notice the blip kind of post-COVID, and a lot of that is associated with supply chain and tariff issues. But even the bottom part of that curve, the kind of cheapest solar panels, are still cheaper than they've ever been. And so when the utilities run their long range forecasts, they're showing that solar makes sense to add in. And this was true even before the recent state law changed requiring utilities to increase their percentage of power from renewables. If you go on to the next slide, this actually shows the comparison to other energy technologies. It's small. There's a citation so you can go and see it. Solar, large scale solar is that second line in there. And if you compare it to things below the dotted line, it is cost competitive with things including the very bottom line, natural gas. The orange dots are what it costs to keep those existing power plants operational. And so in many situations, it's cheaper to build new solar than to keep that coal plant operational. If you go on to the next slide, this is just showing the increased deployment of small scale solar. This is, again, rooftop, backyard solar panels across Michigan. As those costs have been coming down, we have seen an exponential rise in solar deployment because it's cheaper than ever. If you go to the next slide, we've also seen this rise in utility scale solar projects. So this is showing a snapshot of the solar in the state of Michigan. And this is only projects that are about a megawatt. So that's like 5 acres. Projects that are smaller than there are not necessarily captured. So even if you don't know much about energy, just look at the numbers here. We have 1,700 megawatts across kind of 68 projects. And just for what it's worth, in the last 12 months, that number increased by 760. So a year ago, we had about 1,000 megawatts. Now we've got 1,700. If you go on to the next slide, you'll see that there's even more planned. So there's 15,000 solar project, megawatts of solar, not that many projects, it's a 100 or so, solar projects that are in the queue for interconnection, and this is just in the state of Michigan. So if a solar developer wants to connect into the transmission lines, they need to effectively apply to see if there's enough space or what the upgrade costs are going to, what upgrading those lines would cost to allow them to connect in. So not all 16,000 megawatts that are shown here are going to be built. This is an early part of a developer's process to understand whether that project is viable. But a whole bunch of it will be built in part, again, to satisfy the requirements that utilities increase the amount of power from renewables. I also want to mention here that the little gray dots on that map are what are called hybrid facilities. And this is solar plus storage. So there's about 1,500 megawatts of solar plus storage, and that's combining solar with a utility scale battery. And if you go to the next slide, it's just a quick note on energy storage. So currently, we don't have tons in the state of Michigan. We have about 117 megawatts. There's the oldest kind of battery of utility scale that's been on the grid is in Kalamazoo, on Western Michigan University's campus. I'm kind of going around from the upper left. Just commissioned earlier this summer is Tibbetts, which is in Coldwater Township. And actually, for the Michiganders who are MAP members, Michigan Association of Planning is doing a renewable energy tour this Thursday, 2 days from now, and it will be visiting the Tibbetts facility along with 2 solar farms. So I've not been behind the fence of this one, so that's a great opportunity. There's a large battery facility planned in Trenton on old DTE property that would be 220 megawatts, and there's also a 14 megawatt facility already in Wayne County. If you want to know more about storage, there's the link to our best guide. I've got hard copies too that I'm happy to send people around. We're going to talk about, obviously, mostly about solar today, but increasingly these two technologies are being paired together. And in more urban environments, so at the utility scale, storage is the more likely of the technologies that could be cited. All right, next slide is taking off the storage hat and going back to solar. So some common solar components. Again, going from the upper left, we'll kind of go clockwise. This is showing bifacial panels. So most of the solar panels that are in solar farms in the state of Michigan are bifacial, which means that they can produce power from the top side and the bottom side. That's particularly useful in Michigan if there's snow cover on the ground. The albedo of the sun reflecting off of that snow allows those solar panels to produce power even in the winter and actually helps melt any snow that accumulates on the top faster. There's awesome research from Michigan Tech about this. The next picture is showing racking and tracking. So effectively, the racking are those posts that the solar panels are sitting on, and there's a bar, like a bar that's parallel to the ground that is part of this racking and tracking system. Tracking means that that the solar panels effectively follow the sun through the course of the day. And while small projects, some in Michigan sometimes often used fixed tilt solar panels. Increasingly large solar farms are moving to single axis trackers. So they'll start facing the east in the morning and tilt to the west by the end of the day. The next box in the lower right is showing a transformer and an inverter. So the inverter takes the DC power that solar panels produce and inverts it to AC power, which is what our grid runs on. And then the transformer steps up the voltage so that DC power doesn't lose, there's not as much line losses when you're moving it from the solar farm to connect into the grid. You have less losses at higher voltages. And the lower left is showing a similar picture, kind of what these can look like. That GE container there, the inverter is inside. There's also a weather station. Again, solar panels, arrays can be super smart in understanding kind of adapting to high wind conditions. They tilt so that they don't get hurt, thinking about rain and snow. And so there's lots of different equipment that's associated with a solar project. On the next slide, you'll see that the SolSmart training covers all different types of projects. Most of what I do focuses on the large stuff, and so I'll come back and talk about that later. But you already know that solar can be deployed on rooftops. We're showing it here, the commercial solar carport on MSU's campus. We treat this as an accessory ground-mounted system when it's over parking. There's other kind of accessory ground-mounted backyard solar systems, and then principal use SES is solar energy systems. If you go to the next slide, this is my opportunity to hand it over to Kelsey.
Great, thank you, Sarah. So we heard a lot about solar in Michigan and about SolSmart as a program. But so how do we get the solar into our planning? How do we make this part of our normal procedures? So this next section, we're talking about just that. So when we think about solar and local planning, the best practice we like to follow is directly incorporating and sort of baking in solar into the appropriate local plan. So what that local plan is for your jurisdiction, it'll vary place to place, but thinking about what the right fit is for you. And so to come up with these kind of solar procedures that we'd like to follow, we're going to do a high level run through of them right now, but then we're going to go into greater detail of each of these steps. So first, we're going to identify for us, for our jurisdiction, our solar and clean energy goals, which might look different than our neighbors. We'll think about how we're going to achieve those goals, the strategies we'll use, any updates we need to make to policies and procedures, and then how we'll track our progress on those goals. And then we also want to think about which plans might make sense for us to integrate solar into. And so, again, this will vary place to place, but you might think about the comprehensive plan. If you have an energy or climate plan, or maybe you have one under construction or aspire to have one of those types of plans, solar is a great fit for those as well. There might be some sort of special focus plan in your area. Think about natural resources, transportation, things along those lines, kind of special focus planning topics. And then there also might be sub-area plans in your area that are particularly well suited to also include solar as a topic area. So think about what that might look like for your jurisdiction. You might have a couple plans that it makes sense to integrate solar into as well. So don't feel like you only need to choose one. And think broadly about how it might fit for kind of your other planning activities going on in your area. So if you want to go to the next slide, we'll kind of start at the beginning with thinking about developing solar goals for our community. And a great place to start is to take a look at some of the benefits that solar can provide and think about which of these you might want to capitalize in your area. So as an example, so I'm going to do a Sarah in the upper left and then go around. So solar in your community can support climate and sustainability goals that you may already have as part of maybe some climate action planning or other efforts you have underway, or solar can help contribute to goals as you're developing those along those other lines. So maybe you have greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, maybe you have other sustainability goals in your community that solar can contribute to and add to. Next, there might be some local, oh, I'm sorry, can you stay on that slide? I'm just going to go to the next photo. So in the next upper right now, solar can help generate local energy. So that might be of interest to your community as well. Maybe that feels like the right fit to develop local clean energy. Maybe there's some energy reliability questions that solar could help address in your area. So that's something to consider as well. Below that one with the image of the home, there could be some questions and concerns around utility bill costs and maybe price stability in your area. And solar can help maybe kind of smooth those out, make things a little bit more reliable and predictable when it comes to those costs. And then in the lower left, if there's greater solar demand and interest in your area, that can help increase solar installation jobs and maybe also contribute to economic development in different ways. So thinking about kind of some of the benefits that could come from solar can help you determine some of the solar goals you might want to reach towards. So now on the next slide, thank you so much. Another way to kind of keep honing in on these goals is to engage stakeholders. And so a best practice here is to engage stakeholders kind of along the spectrum. Engage almost anyone you can think of, including detractors. I feel like sometimes detractors are some of the most important people to include in discussions on different topics because they bring a different perspective, which can be important to get intel on. So involving stakeholders can help you, again, kind of get clear on those benefits, the benefits that maybe some of these local organizations or local residents or building or business owners might look to see from solar, what benefits could really benefit them. In particular, there might be different, goals that they have that solar can help them achieve. And they'll also be very helpful in identifying issues and concerns that would be really helpful to know about early on. What do you need to consider as you're developing your goals and strategies that you don't want to overlook? You want to reduce those negative impacts as much as you can across the board for all different groups. And this process could also help identify current gaps in current programming you have, financing opportunities, information distribution channels. I think that's another big one to think about is who are you reaching and how? And so engaging with stakeholders can kind of help you see where people are coming from right now, sort of meeting them where they are, but then seeing where you can help fill in the gaps and where this solar programming that you're developing could also help fill in some gaps. And then finally, looking to the future, thinking about opportunities, some of the positive results that integrating solar into planning could have for your community and your residents and the people who work and play in your community as well. So on the next slide, so we've thought about some benefits from solar. We've spoken to a lot of stakeholders. So we want to kind of narrow in and get specific after we have all of this information. Which goals do we want to reach for? And we like to say that we are goal agnostic over here at SoulSmart. The right goal is the right goal for your community. It's very helpful if goals are both specific and measurable. You've probably heard of SMART goals. That's another way to think about it. And so you'll see some examples here on the slide that are both specific and measurable. But again, these may not be a fit for your community. Some may be, some might not be. But this is kind of a starting place, some examples to think about. So you might think about number of projects installed. Maybe that's kind of a good goal to reach towards. We want to get 2 projects installed by 2030, kind of something along those lines. Or maybe you want to think about installed capacity. You could also get specific around the types of solar projects installed. So maybe you have some underutilized land, maybe a brownfield in your community that's a big goal is to get solar on that property. Or maybe you'd like to get some solar installed on some jurisdiction-owned property. Maybe it's a community center, maybe it's the fire station, police station, other buildings like that. You might also think about percentage of energy demand that you'd like to meet with solar, whether that's community-wide or the municipal buildings themselves or municipal energy demand themselves. And then you might also set up some numbers and percentages around serving low-income residents and maybe building or property owners and assist those residents as well. So just some ideas. The right goal is the right goal for your community, but making it specific really helps you understand the progress you're making on that goal. So if you go to the next slide, so we have our goals, they're nice and specific now, and then we're going to think about how can we get there. And so we want to figure out where we're starting from to figure out what we might need to tweak in order to reach those goals. So we're going to start by taking a look at the status quo. So these questions below are some things you can consider, kind of take the lay of the land and then see where you can make some adjustments to kind of get closer and make it easier for you all to reach your goals. So thinking about, we're in the planning section, so think about your zoning regulations. Is the code where it needs to be to help you achieve your goals, or maybe do you need some amendments? Are there some other adjustments you can make? Maybe the code has a big update coming soon, and that's a great opportunity to include some additional or updated language as it pertains to solar. And thinking about the staff as well, and staff across the board. So planning and zoning staff, but also Deb was talking about permitting and inspections, maybe the building department staff, kind of however your jurisdiction is laid out. Does the staff have the training and knowledge that they need to help support these goals? Maybe there's some additional information that would help them. Think about the permitting rules and procedures themselves. You know, there might be some unintended barriers, thinking about fees, timelines, clarity of process. Permit applications, kind of all of those pieces, how can you make that a little bit easier so that it can help you work towards your solar goals? And who do you need to work with? You know, it's very difficult to get things done sort of in a vacuum. Those partnerships are so important. So thinking about who is a really, you know, kind of a collaborative partner that you can connect with. These could be varied across the community. So lots of different folks to consider partnering with to help you achieve your solar goals, but then they may have kind of complementary goals that that partnership could help them achieve as well. And then continuing to think about stakeholders. So stakeholder engagement is kind of an ongoing process in different ways, shapes, and forms as you're working on your solar efforts, but continuing to keep that in mind as you have an opportunity to do that engagement. So on the next slide, we're almost done here. Yeah. So we have our clear specific goal. We've evaluated our systems to be sure that we can successfully work towards those goals. And then we want to track the progress we're making on those goals. And so again, this will look a little bit different depending on the goals and how you're reaching for them. But you'll want to consider your tracking methods and your reporting methods, sort of how are you gathering that data? How frequently are you gathering, you know, information and progress on your goals, and making maybe updates to your approach? You know, you learn as you go, and you might find ways to improve the approach you're taking to reach your goals. And then think about how you're reporting out on this. Is it, you know, is all the information public? Is some of it internal? Is it a combination of the two? Maybe there's annual public releases, but quarterly internal reporting. So thinking about how you can really stay on track and planning for that in advance can lead to more success down the line. So thinking about that's pretty helpful in terms of eventual success. And I think this is the last slide. If you go to the next slide. So we always like to share an example from the state that we're visiting virtually. And here's an example from the Ypsilanti Climate Action Plan. And I know the font is maybe a little light in color, but you can see kind of in the middle right, they have an annual solar goal of 20 kilowatts installed. So it's very specific, 20 kilowatts installed each year. And then below in the recommended approach, that first sentence there, that bolded sentence says, monitor financing opportunities for solar installation and publicize via Solar IPSI. And so that's sort of their mechanism and approach. So they want to achieve this installation goal, and the jurisdiction staff are going to look for opportunities to get financing and assistance to make these installations happen. And they're going to share out, they're going to publicize public engagement, stakeholder engagement to try to make that happen. There's a little bit more context there as well. And certainly you can visit this plan online. It's one of our goals as well. You know, this is something you can go look at, read in more detail. And even if you want, reach out to the local jurisdiction staff. Maybe they'd have some advice and some suggestions for your own efforts in this area. It makes it a little bit more approachable than kind of a nebulous suggestion out there to have an actual jurisdiction you can connect with on this topic. So that concludes this planning section. So next, I believe it's Deb to cover best practices in zoning.
Thanks, Kelsey. So yeah, we are going to dive into best practices in zoning for solar. I'm going to focus mostly on accessory use solar and turn it over to Sarah to talk about some of the specifics on the larger utility scale stuff. But if you go to the next slide, and as you do that, so one of the things I should have mentioned with SoulSmart, every participating community receives a zoning review as part of the free technical assistance. So we spend a lot of time reading and reviewing zoning ordinances. And after doing that, again, the program's been around for 9 years. Here's our highest level kind of recommendations summed up. So our advice. First, explicitly recognize and address the different forms of solar development. And Sarah walked through some of those. So really differentiating, solar has evolved a lot and matured a lot. So it's no longer kind of one thing, maybe rooftop solar. There's a number of different types of projects and really having a clear set of definitions for all of those types that will occur in your community is important. Second is really thinking about creating what we call by right or permitted installation opportunities. So thinking about the kinds of projects that are just going to be allowed by right in your community and being clear about those. Again, there are projects that are going to need more review and conditional use permits and have a lot of nuance. But there, at this point, a lot of solar projects, particularly rooftop residential systems, are pretty plug and play. Kind of see the same system types over and over again. So thinking about what you can allow as a permitted use and really create a nice, easy pathway for those projects. The third is a set of recommendations I would have for any zoning topic, which is to have clear and predictable standards. And so really, again, taking a look at your zoning ordinance, is it clear how you get a permit? What are the standards for those projects to meet so that it is as efficient as possible for somebody who wants to do one of these projects to move through your process? The more predictable you can make that process, the more affordable solar becomes in the community, and developers can basically reduce their margins if they know what they need to do, what the process is going to be, and how they're going to get that permit. Avoiding unintentional barriers to solar. And I think this is where a third-party zoning review can be really helpful. A lot of communities don't even realize some of the barriers that they're creating with language that they have. An example of this is, solar systems really, they need to face the sun and they need to be laid out to really maximize their potential. I mean, Sarah mentioned, in Michigan, you already have a little bit less of a solar resource than in other parts of the country. So when we have regulations that say, the system can't be can't be visible from the street. Well, if someone's south-facing roof is facing the street, you effectively just created a barrier to that person, installing solar in a way that would make sense and would maximize their return on investment. So again, looking for places that we're creating, unintentional barriers so that our solar systems can be laid out to be just, optimally efficient and produce as much power as possible, which means they get the best return on investment for that homeowner or business owner. Enabling the capture or of desired co-benefits really gets to something that Kelsey mentioned. So hopefully if your community has thought about what do you want out of these systems, is it more about energy resilience? Is it about workforce development? Is it about protecting natural resources? Making sure that you are essentially enabling those projects to produce those co-benefits and looking at your regulations through that lens so that again, if it's brownfields development and you're looking to create solar projects that really increase the economics of the sites, the economic value of those sites, making sure it would be allowed on that brownfield site. So ensuring that you're going to get or hopefully get what you're looking for out of those projects. Again, related to what Kelsey was saying, considering the concerns that you heard in planning and making sure that you set appropriate conditions. So if stakeholders are worried about impact to historic resources, for example, or impact to agricultural soils, making sure that those considerations that were raised or concerns that were raised are factored into your rules, your regulations, and your standards. And then lastly, looking across the region and ideally seeking some regional consistency. So the reality is, solar markets are not kind of one town at a time. We can get thriving solar markets when across a region we have, again, strong permitting and consistent processes. And that's where we can really start to see costs come down for a whole regional market. So as much as possible, really looking at your neighboring communities and together creating the conditions for a strong market. So again, those are kind of our high level advice. So let's dig in on some really kind of detailed recommendations. First, before we go there, just same exact slide that Sarah showed to think about these different project types. As you look at your zoning regulation, again, I think continually asking, are we addressing all of these different types of projects that may occur in our community, and kind of coming at it with that lens. So a lot of communities do have some regulations around rooftop solar, but is it clear how you would permit a carport? Is it clear for somebody who wanted to do a ground mount accessory use? So that's really serving the home or business that's right there on site. It's an accessory to that primary use. And then principal use solar, obviously a fairly new land use, right? When I started my career, solar was not a land use. And so a lot of details there to get into. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, starting at the very beginning of the ordinance, 2 things to look for. It is best practice to really clearly state solar or clean energy as part of your purpose statement. So why are you regulating this? And if you can tie that back to some goals that you have, even better. So if you can say part of the zoning ordinance is to implement the goals identified in our clean energy plan, or the goals identified in our comp plan related to energy. That again is the best practice, that those are reflected in your planning efforts, and you're kind of bringing that into your zoning to be the implementation piece of that goal. The other best practice is about your definitions, and here is a set. There is no perfect set of solar definitions. I think Sarah's group has some examples in the resource that she shared. Here's a set to look at, but the point really is to make sure you have the set of definitions you need to make all the pieces of the ordinance make sense, and to be as clear as possible, again, about the different projects that you'll be permitting. So a definition of solar energy system at minimum, and we recommend that include reference to energy storage. So you see that here, and having a good definition that works for your ordinance. Whether you need separate definitions for things like grid connected systems, again, it depends how you're going to regulate different projects. But I would say at minimum, being clear about how you're going to regulate roof mounted solar, ground mounted solar being used as an accessory use. Again, the project that we showed with the home on the site, and then ground mounted solar used as a primary use. From there, whether you want to have different sizes differentiated, often that makes sense for communities. So to say, a system under 10 acres is going to be like this. So system over 10 acres is going to be like that. But I would say this is a pretty basic set to start with. If you go to the next slide, some other words and definitions to consider. Again, battery energy storage. I would increasingly say just about every community should have a definition of battery energy storage. It is, if you haven't seen a lot of this development yet, I think it's coming, and most communities, particularly if you're going through an ordinance update, I would take that opportunity to go ahead and include a definition of energy storage. Agrivoltaics, if this is something your community wants to encourage, I would consider adding a definition. So agrivoltaics is when we are going to have a piece of property that is both being used for agricultural uses as well as producing electricity, and being really clear that both of those uses are going to be on the land. And so again, if this is appropriate, it's something your community wants to encourage, I think it's worth thinking about whether you should have that definition in there and have some encouraging language in there. Pollinator friendly, again, it gets back to what are those goals of your community, and is this something that makes sense for you? But this references in Indiana, there's some guidance about pollinator species. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense to have this exact definition in Michigan, but again, we could work with that language if that's something that your community wants to encourage. And then the last one, again, bright fields. So this is solar on something like brownfields, redeveloped land, land that was formerly used for like an industrial use. If that's kind of the nature of your community and you want to encourage brownfield redevelopment into solar, it might make sense to think about having a definition of bright field. So again, I think really looking at those definitions, making sure it's going to reflect the types of projects that you're likely to see in your community or that you want to encourage and the kinds of co-benefits that you want to see. If you go to the next slide, the next part of the ordinance that we look at is kind of how you talk about uses and what are permitted uses or conditional uses or prohibited uses. And our recommendation in terms of best practice is to make rooftop solar a permitted accessory use in all districts where you have buildings. So again, that vision of solar mounted to the roof, we think should be allowed just about everywhere. Similar with energy storage as an accessory use. So this is somebody maybe who wants like a Tesla power wall, something like that. And then ground mounted solar as an accessory use in most or all districts. And again, you have to think about the nature of your community, but in all but maybe the most urban communities, it may be hard to do ground mounted as a permitted use, but in most kind of residential suburban districts, allowing people the option to put solar on the property, maybe their roof doesn't make sense, maybe it's shaded, something like that. So ensuring that they have that option if they need it. So if you go to the next slide, we have a very, very simplified use chart, and probably most of your zoning ordinances have something like this. So, in the column, you would have every zoning district that you have. Again, this is an overly simplified version, but a residential district, an agricultural district. And then again, at minimum for the simplified version, having, clarity around accessory solar, utility scale solar, maybe community scale, again, depending if you want to regulate different sizes differently, and being clear whether it's a permitted use, a conditional use, a prohibited use. And I will say, I hear this from developers sometimes, like if you want to say it's prohibited, they would rather have that clarity that it's prohibited as opposed to, going through a lot of rigmarole to ultimately get rejected. So if there's a district in your community that, it should be prohibited, your stakeholders feel that way, I think solar developers would much rather just see that and know that and be able to focus on where it's going to be allowed. And they want to propose projects that ultimately will be acceptable to you. So anyway, again, just being as clear as possible about these different uses and how they're going to map to your different zoning districts. On the next slide, let's get into some standards. And again, these are best practices that the SolSmart program promotes and how we kind of address some of the different issues. So we'll start with height, particularly for flat roofs. So best practice here is to exempt roof-mounted solar from height limits, or to say that they can exceed that height limit by a set amount. And the reason for that is a lot of buildings were built to the height limit. People took advantage of every inch. And so that, if you don't allow an exemption for solar to exceed that, then that building would not be allowed to have solar. So again, just allowing this for an existing building that wants to add solar, an exemption to your roof height limit. Next slide. Setbacks, and this is for accessory use solar. So we'll talk about setbacks in large scale, but for accessory use, providing clear guidance on the placement of ground-mounted accessory use. So we often see communities, for example, encourage use of the side yard or rear, allowing those systems maybe to have some encroachment into the setback if that makes sense. What we basically say is look at what you allow for other similar accessory uses, and whether that's mechanical or accessory uses like a small shed, whatever you're allowing for those other accessory uses would be appropriate to also allow for solar. So if you're reducing your setback requirement for something like a shed, consider doing that also for the ground-mounted systems. Hopefully just is creating as much of an enabling environment for homeowners to put these systems where they are going to generate as much electricity as possible, again, to kind of drive down those costs and the return on investment for that owner. On the next slide, as impervious cover, we get a lot of questions about this. So best practice is to exempt ground-mounted systems from the calculation of impervious cover as long as the area under them is vegetated. And there's basically research that supports that these are not going to, they're not different really than a vegetated surface. So exempting them from those calculations in your ordinance makes sense. On the next slide, visual impact or aesthetics is also something we hear a lot about. And best practice here really is to exempt solar from any screening requirements. So again, if we're trying to screen the system and make people not see it, we're probably creating shade and other issues and affecting where those panels can be. And ideally, we're allowing those panels to be where it makes the most sense to generate as much power as possible. So we don't want to have a lot of requirements about trying to keep them out of the public view. We do sometimes see that kind of language. The system shouldn't be visible from the right of way. Again, we would say best practices is not to do that, and just to allow homeowners, business owners to put the panels where they are going to make sense to generate as much as possible, and to really try to limit those screening or aesthetic requirements. That's also adding cost, right? When we require people to do other things or add visual screening, that's adding cost to the project, which ultimately it affects the economics of the project. On the next slide, in historic districts, really here it's about providing clear guidance. There's a lot of good examples. There's communities that have done some really nice visuals and examples of how solar can be placed appropriately while preserving historic character. And we really just look for, are you being clear about the process for how those projects will be reviewed and any standards that will be utilized? Again, as much as the process can be clear, then developers can navigate that process and hopefully get through that and be able to do solar in ways that your community agrees are appropriate in something like a historic district. Next slide. So pivoting now to talk about principal use solar. So again, the image, solar not attached to a building on site, essentially a power plant, a solar power plant. This is a unique land use. First of all, some communities regulate it using their industrial land use. It's pretty unique, right? So a large-scale solar project is not going to generate a lot of sound. It's not really an industrial use. It's not going to generate pollution or have a lot of cars or traffic associated with it. So we really think it is a unique land use and again, deserves to be kind of uniquely regulated in your definitions and your standards. We do think that definition should include storage and it should be clear how you would regulate a project that is a large-scale solar project with storage. And again, it may make sense depending on your community and the kind of development you expect to be distinguishing between different size systems. If you're going to do that, we recommend, and Sarah and I haven't talked about this, but curious her thoughts here, but we recommend focusing on the acreage of the project and not the capacity or energy production of the project. Solar panels have gotten more efficient over time. So, and presumably that will continue. So focusing on, again, for example, how you'll regulate a 10-acre project as opposed to having rules about the megawatts or the production of that system. For the most part, we think is a better way to go. So on the next slide. So typically, most communities use a conditional use approval to look at large-scale solar projects. We do encourage communities to think about where, if there are places in the community that you would allow these as a permitted use. And again, for a community maybe that has a lot of brownfield opportunities or has a large piece of land, it may be appropriate to allow large-scale solar to be permitted use. We do think it's important to explicitly allow dual use, to be clear that there could be two uses of the land. For example, solar and agriculture, solar and parking, if you're allowing solar as a primary use, but you want to kind of see these kinds of projects, it's really helpful, I think, to explicitly allow dual use of the land. We encourage habitat-friendly ground cover. I think that should come through in your regulation, and there's a lot of great examples there. In terms of visual screening, so with the larger scale solar projects, we certainly see communities want to mitigate the impact on the view shed for certain projects. We do think you should be thinking about your different zoning districts and whether that makes sense. In a more industrial zoning district, you may not be as concerned about view shed, and potentially in an agricultural district, maybe you are. So being specific about in what districts you're really worried about that visual impact. The other thing I want to say on visual screening is to really think about whatever your setback requirements are, and then make sure there's a balance with your visual screening. So if you have a big setback requirement, you're probably already addressing kind of how visual that site is from the road or from a certain point. So do you also need to add screening? Again, every time you add those requirements, you're adding cost to a project and affecting the economics of that project, the feasibility of that project. So if your setback is already such that the project is going to be set far back off the road, you may not need screening requirements, or maybe you minimize that setback and you add screening requirements to mitigate that visual. You probably don't need both kind of at the maximum extent. So just thinking about those things and how they play off of one another. And lastly, definitely best practice to require a decommissioning plan. And I think the model ordinance that Sarah has all of that covered. But certainly want to think about the end of the life of the project, who's responsible for decommissioning it, and how that process will go. On the next slide, a little bit more on setbacks. So this is probably one of the most frequent questions we get is what should be the setback? And there's no hard and fast rule or number, but some questions I think to ask yourself as you set those requirements. First, like I said before, what are your setbacks for similar types of development? I think really thinking of solar as you think of other development in your community and what would be fair there. Thinking about what you're trying to accomplish with the setback. So again, if that's about reducing the visibility of the system or something else, right? Thinking about what is the goal of your setback and how does that apply in different districts? As you write the rules for setbacks, make sure you're clear about how they should be measured. Again, this is probably similar to what you already require for other types of development, but making sure you're clear about, is that from the center of the road or from the property line, just making sure you have all of that clearly laid out. Trying to limit how much you have to go back and forth with developers on all of these issues. And then in some cases, thinking about if there's a difference in the setback from a property line versus a neighboring home. And we've seen that in some communities where they distinguish those setbacks and have a different number there. On the next slide, I think I'm almost at the end, the home stretch. Just a couple other considerations. If these are applicable to you, we have more resources. How solar might fit in with something like planned unit development regulations. And then examples of things like solar ready ordinances and regulations. So again, SolSmart has a lot of resources. If doing something like a solar ready ordinance makes sense, we're happy to connect you with resources. And what that means is requiring new construction to basically have the conduits and the infrastructure to add solar later. And so that building is considered solar ready, which drives down the cost ultimately of adding solar in the future. So if you go to the next slide, just a brief second again on unintentional barriers, the things that we commonly see that often communities don't even realize are creating challenges or driving up the cost of these projects. Unclear processes and standards is definitely at the top of that list. So as much as possible, being clear about what's going to be required in order to get a permit or to build a project in your community. Discretionary review. So we sometimes see this. If you apply for a solar project, this committee is going to review the project, but there's no standards. It's not clear kind of what that review consists of, what that committee is looking for. So as much as possible, limiting discretionary reviews, and again, being really clear about the process. And then lastly, requirements that add cost, but really aren't providing a lot of value. And an example of that is the requirement for a glare study. Again, this is putting a cost on the developer, but solar panels essentially don't create any more glare than a lake or windows in a building. Unless they are near an airport, in which case there are specific regulations for solar that's placed near an airport, there's really no value to requiring a glare study, and really no need for concern there. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah Mills, who is going to talk to us about some of the very specific Michigan considerations when it comes to navigating large-scale solar development.
Great, thank you. If you want to go to the next slide, most of Deb's best practices are things that we built into our guides that I'll talk about later in solar. But Deb mentioned kind of differentiating based on acreage versus megawatts. We recommend differentiating based on megawatts in part because of PA 233. So this is the law that was passed at the end of 2023 that came into effect last year. And this creates an option for developers to go to the Public Service Commission to get their land use permit rather than go through local zoning. And that effectively is only possible for projects of 50 megawatts or larger for solar or storage, larger than that for wind, but that's not coming to Oakland County. So you need to worry about the wind side. To be clear, a developer is not required to go to the Public Service Commission. They can stay local, but the law says that there's one possibility of when they have to be local, and that is if there is a compatible renewable energy ordinance. If you go to the next slide, this kind of lays out what that means then is that there are 4 different pathways that a local government can take. One is adopting that CREO, the Compatible Renewable Energy Ordinance, and what is allowed to be in that is laid out very explicitly in the state law. The next option is the local government can choose to send any developer that comes to them with a large solar or storage project, send them to the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission will use the same setbacks and height limits and sound limits. But the Public Service Commission also plans to have this list of minimum conditions that they will expect developers to incorporate. And also the Public Service Commission has some additional evaluation criteria, including impacts on local land uses and farmland, which is not in the CREO path. But again, as I mentioned, it's not just those 2 pathways. A local government can have an incompatible ordinance, and we divide this into 2 different paths. There's a workable ordinance there in yellow, which is incompatible because it's stricter in some way than the green CREO path. But it's workable because it means that it's making room for renewables. The other option is an unworkable ordinance, which is not compatible, and the developer effectively says, I can't work with this ordinance. And in that situation, actually in either the yellow or the red situation, the developer can instead go to the Public Service Commission, that blue path. If you go to the next slide, a question often arises like, is anybody really going to do a workable ordinance, or will a developer try to work it out? Yes. In fact, since the law passed, projects were approved in more than 40 jurisdictions under workable ordinances. There have been 0 approved at the state level. There are 3 right now where developers have tried to get state level approval, and the Public Service Commission is evaluating whether or not those applications are complete. The reason that workable paths are an option is that PA 233 is really a backstop. It is not intended to be the first choice for developers. Honestly, from a developer's perspective, the green Creo path is their top choice because local governments have time limits, and there is a very small list of things that you are allowed to include in your ordinance if you want to go the Creo path. But the workable path in talking to developers and just seeing what's going on, that's the next best option from a developer's perspective. So long as the local ordinance is not more onerous or expensive than the Public Service Commission path. All right, if you go to the next slide, the other reason that that workable ordinances can work is that the state has this Renewable Ready Communities Award that pays $5,000 per megawatt to local governments that are able to work it out with a developer. And that can be either through the Creo path or workable path. If instead the developer takes the project to the Public Service Commission, the developer needs to pay $2,000 per megawatt to the local government. So the Renewable Ready Communities Award makes it in the best interest of the developer and the local government to do something at the local level. Okay, now it's next slide, please. Okay, so what's in a Creo? It's really limited. You can see the complete list of what you're allowed to include for solar in a Creo. This is a conservative interpretation of a Creo. We have a Creo ordinance that's annotated, and you can see what we mean by conservative. But effectively, I'll be really honest, the numbers themselves are pretty permissive. And so it's exactly what a developer would want the local government to do. If you go to the next slide, this adds on the same list that's on the Creo, but if a project goes to the Public Service Commission, the Public Service Commission has said that it's likely to have some conditions associated with screening, vegetative ground cover, underground facilities, sound studies, pre-operation emergency and response training. So those are things that in a conservative interpretation of Creo, you can't require, but the Public Service Commission has said it anticipates including these things. If you go to the next slide. So the question that local governments are facing, if they have 4 permitting options, is like, why to do any of these? So I got a slide on why and a slide on why not. So the reason to do a Creo is that you want to attract developers to your place. You want to be the first in line. It also is the only pathway that guarantees that it stays, the decision stays local. There is this risk for multi-jurisdictional projects is that if a solar or storage project is in multiple jurisdictions, if any one of them does not have a Creo, the developer can take the whole project to the Public Service Commission. So many of these projects do cross local jurisdiction lines, and effectively all of the local governments need to have a Creo in order to guarantee that it stays local. It's also pretty minimal municipal workload, like you just follow the template and there's an and you're eligible for that $5,000 per megawatt RRCA payment. The reason to be a local government and send things to the Public Service Commission is that you are comfortable with the Public Service Commission process and want them to be able to apply those conditions. It's actually the easiest from a local municipal workload perspective because you're not evaluating the application. In the Public Service Commission path, your local government still gets $2,000 per megawatt. And honestly, a lot of the communities that are considering the Public Service Commission path is that they just want to pass the accountability and kind of the due diligence that's required of evaluating a large-scale renewables project to the state rather than do this at the local level. The reason to do a workable ordinance is that you're able to include more preferences, more local preferences in it than what you could do through the green Creo pathway. And if you are having conversations and showing your flexibility and that you really do want to permit this locally, it's unlikely for a developer to go to the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission has a year to evaluate their proposal. Most of the local processes are much quicker than that. The other reason to do a workable ordinance is that it maintains this local process and again, makes you eligible for that $5,000 per megawatt. There are reasons to do an unworkable ordinance. I mean, unworkable ordinances, to be clear, are the reason that we have PA 233 in the first place. But unworkable ordinances allow a local government to express all of their community preferences. And so there's not as much work in trying to sort out what is workable. Like you can just put it all in there. The reality, though, is that it's very likely if you've got a developer interested in doing something in your jurisdiction, the developer is going to move you down the blue path, just so you know. If you go to the next slide, these are the why nots. So in a CREO, you really can't add any additional preferences in it. And there are some penalties if you say you have a CREO and don't. And I already mentioned that it really depends on what your neighbors are doing. In the Public Service Commission path, you don't have the discretion to add more preferences. Local governments are interveners at the Public Service Commission and can therefore say the things that they'd like the Public Service Commission to add in, but you don't have direct control. You don't get the Renewable Ready Communities Award, and there's not the local process that your government is participating in. And the workable path, the reason not to do it is that it takes a lot of work to figure out like what it is that you can ask for and balance like what would make this project better in your community's eyes with not being so onerous that your ordinance is suddenly going to become unworkable. And again, it runs this risk of being called incompatible and the developer going to the Public Service Commission. For unworkable, the big risk is that there is a high risk of losing the local process and a developer just going to the Public Service Commission. And you might actually turn away developers. You might be attracting developers who are really gung-ho to use the Public Service Commission path and not ones that are interested in kind of working it out. You've effectively laid your cards on the table that you don't want a project, and it might be attracting a different kind of developer. If you want to go to the next slide, I'll just say, I've already talked about how, so I want to instead go to the next slide about tools. One more slide, please. All right, so the workable path is the hardest one to do. To try to make it a little bit easier, we have pulled together a past workable ordinance database that pulls together all of the projects that have been approved in the state of Michigan in recent years and what was in their zoning ordinances. It also differentiates the projects that were approved before PA 233 and after PA 233 because the bar of what is workable may have moved. And so we've pulled those together. If you go to the next slide, we also have this same guidance in our zoning guide, which again follows 99% of the best practices that Deb mentioned. This is a table from the middle of this guide laying out each of the 3 pathways. We don't have the unworkable path laid out here, but for key considerations like what it would look like in a CREO, what it looks like in the MPSC path, and what it would look like in a workable ordinance path. If you go to the next slide, you will have the link to this guide done with funding from the state's energy office in Eagle and in collaboration with Michigan State Extension. And I think there's 2 more slides for Deb to wrap up next. Oh, one more slide that is me, which is to say the first half is a lot of like what you need to know about solar, and the second half is a fill in the blank zoning ordinance. Again, not one right setback distance, but we give some guidance on how you might think about it. Okay, now I think it's Deb.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and just really quickly, again, everyone I think will get the slide deck. So we included a couple other resources we thought would be of interest. If you go to the next slide, we had 2 webinars on, again, these topics seem to be of high interest. So agrivoltaics, we have a great recorded webinar there. And then fire risk associated with energy storage. Again, get a lot of questions from local governments, and this was a really great webinar that you can access. On the next slide, for those of you who are professional planners or have your AICP certification, this is available for credit. And so just want to provide that reference number to make it as easy as possible. If you go into the APA website, that reference number will take you right to the spot. And I think with that, we're ready for questions.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. We do have a couple of questions. What types of energy does the Renewable Energy Standard PA 235 count as quote unquote renewable?
I'm gonna dig that up. There's two different differentiations. There's renewable and there's clean. I'm gonna pull up the law and I'll come back. So ask another one, Jim, and then when I have the answer, I'll chime.
Okay, this is a question that says, this was a great resource, and I believe it's the book that you were just showing, Sarah. Has this been shared with all of our community's planning consultants, even if they aren't attending this session?
So this is available online. The hard copy that I held up was actually mailed to every planning commission in the state. MAP mailed this out. I also have boxes of these. So you can ask me for hard copies. We'll also be at the American Planning, or like at the MAP conference. And so we'll bring some with us.
Okay, excellent. How long do solar panels last, and are they recyclable, reusable, or what's the disposal situation?
Deb, I'm going to let you take that while I get the definition of renewable.
Sure. And I was just trying to find my mute button there. So, I mean, we typically say like 20 to 25 years, but a lot of these projects have not actually reached the end of their life. So a lot of things about, for example, decommissioning plans, we haven't really lived through it yet on these larger scale projects. So I would just say that, a lot of the things that we recommend in decommissioning plans, we haven't necessarily gone through the full experience yet of these bigger projects coming to the end of their life. The hope is that these projects can be repowered to the extent that that's appropriate, which again depends on the landowner and their plans for their property. But the idea is hopefully panels can be replaced and swapped out, and projects can continue to exist and be financially viable. So we certainly hope many of these projects have a much longer life than 25 years. In terms of recycling, it's, and I don't know, Sarah, if you have a better answer than this, but it's something the industry has really, is taking very seriously and is really working on. So I know at the national level, SEIA, which is the Solar Energy Industry Association, has a lot of work going on to figure out, what we can do with panels at the end of their lives. And it's again, a high priority, but it is certainly a concern. I don't know, Sarah, do you have more to add on recycling?
Other than this is something that I know Eagle has been thinking about now, because solar in Michigan is relatively new. We don't have solar panels that need recycling yet. And so I expect that markets will make themselves available when we get there. The other thing that I say is, particularly if you're thinking about large scale renewables, this is why in your decommissioning, it makes sense to think reevaluate that plan periodically, every 5 years or so that as markets for solar end of life materials come into being, you're prepared for that.
Okay. Next question regarding the trends for cost of solar. Is it anticipated to continue to decrease in cost?
So here's, I think that this is complicated. I don't think it can get too much cheaper, to be really honest. And so I think that we're probably at steady state, ish. I didn't note this, but the slides that I showed did not include kind of tax incentives, federal tax incentives. Those are the real costs. So it's even cheaper when you factor in the tax incentives. Those tax incentives are expiring though. They've already expired for rooftop solar And there will be some new solar projects that are able to claim the federal tax incentive. They still have a couple of years or a year to get those projects off the ground. But those numbers were unsubsidized. So I don't anticipate huge declines. I think that maybe there will be more efficiencies, making every kind of electron that you need cheaper. But I don't expect like it to go down too much. Deb, would you give the same answer? I don't know.
On the hardware side, I would. I mean, there's definitely innovations happening. I was just learning all about new meters and, some of the wraparound pieces of equipment that you need. There's lots of innovation happening there to make it easier to install these systems. But on the hardware side. But what I didn't say, and I usually do in most of my presentations, is the cost of a solar system. We think of it as the hard cost, so the cost of the physical hardware, and then what we call the soft costs, which for particularly like residential rooftop systems is about 65% of the cost is what we call soft costs. And that is where those have actually been very consistent over time. I don't know why my hand is up, but so that is where local governments can really reduce the costs, and it's things like permitting and delays and interconnection delays and other things. So there is still good room for opportunities to drive down costs. And I think as the federal incentives are going away, that is where everyone is focused, is essentially, can we drive down those other costs to maintain the lower cost of solar? We do have a newly released federal policy toolkit, which has the updated information about those tax credits and how they're going to be going away. I will make sure that goes out kind of with this presentation so folks have that. But I would say one thing to note there on the large scale projects is there's some anticipation of a surge in projects that are trying to get built in the next 2 years in order to meet the timelines of those tax credits. So from the local government perspective, you can expect to see developers really trying to hustle to meet the shortened timeline to be able to get that tax credit.
Okay.
On the residential side, essentially, if people don't have signed contracts this month, they've probably missed that because it's the end of the year. Most solar companies that I know have already been subscribed.
All right. Next question. Have you heard the argument that these black solar panels are creating or impacting global warming due to reflecting heat back into the atmosphere?
Solar panel, I've heard it. Solar panels are designed to absorb that. There's some question about heat islands and what that might mean locally. There's some research from the desert, effectively, that says like, actually there can be some effects very locally. And also, that is the desert, that is not the Midwest. I literally 2 days ago was talking to climate scientists here on campus about that study urban heat island and asking about this. Solar panels provide shade, like can shade what's underneath and actually lower the temperature of the ground underneath. And the sense is that in vegetated environments that there would be imperceptible impacts on kind of heat. So that's the latest and greatest that I have. Deb, I don't know, Deb or Kelsey, I don't know if you heard anything else.
Nothing to add. Same.
Okay. Sarah did passed on to me direct chats, a couple of things about some definitions. I've just copied and pasted that for everybody in the chat if you want to check that out. Let's see. Is DTE currently friendly to small residential users in terms of adding to the grid?
They're required to allow small residential users to connect in. I'll be real honest that like utilities make money when they own the infrastructure. So it is not like DTE is building their own solar farms. They're gung-ho on it. They're less gung-ho about residential users. And the Public Utility Commission policies make them play along. And also the PA 235 says that they have to allow at least 10% to connect in. Some of those policies are, or some of the things that make it more friendly than ever before. If you go to DTE's website, there's a host capacity map that shows you where it's easier for you to connect your system, and the kind of regulations, the rules about how you would get your rooftop solar in, the fees associated with that are clearer than ever. So that's what I would say on that.
Okay, great. There's no more questions, Ryan.
Okay, great. So I just want to thank Deb, Sarah, Kelsey, and Nicole for joining us this morning and providing their insights and expertise. It was very informative. So thank you. And also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. And a quick reminder, we do have another planners gathering on October 21st, where we'll learn how partnering with local chambers of commerce can help improve local planning and economic development. So again, thanks everyone for joining and have a wonderful day.